So welcome everybody. It's nice to see some folks from the States that we've done some work in recently or with folks. I'm going to talk about fatality review, and I usually mix and match things up when I do this. So one of the emphases I'm going to put on today is in anticipation of COVID, the pandemic lifting, perhaps in the fall. So I'm going to talk about getting back in the field and also interviewing people. So I've got a significant section in this that's a little different today on interviewing folks. But I'm also going to talk too about how to do virtual reviews, because I do think that they're here to stay. So it'll take me about 1 hour and 20 to go through, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I want to start by discussing some of the historical origins of domestic violence fatality review. And these are really social autopsies, ways of looking at cases where mostly women have been killed. And I think we've come a long way, and it's hard to recognize that, but 50 years ago, there really wasn't very much coverage of these deaths. And 100 years ago, there was even less. And in fact, if it warranted a sentence or two in a newspaper, often the woman who was killed was somehow blamed for her own victimization often. So we've come a long way. We have a lot of detail on these cases, and we've learned a lot from them. And a lot of that, I have to say, is thanks to OVW's intervention and the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. But there was a public outcry about intimate partner homicide that accompanied the rise of second wave feminism, which clearly created a major sort of hullabaloo about these cases. So there was a big political push really from the 70s to focus on these cases. And those changes and those foci were part of changing patterns of women's education and paid employment. Obviously, it was part of the new civil rights movement. The old civil rights movement, of course, dates from the end of the Civil War, but also increases in divorce, particularly no-fault divorce, women's growing control over their reproductive health, the advent of the pill, for example, the birth control pill. Later, the passage of VAWA, the rise of risk societies in general, and the concern to use specialized knowledge to understand phenomena that were troubling us in these different worlds of, say, aviation and nuclear power, medicine. We see as well from the early 70s, the rise of the victims' rights revolution and the idea that victims had rights, and we ought to focus on victim experience as well as prosecuting potentially offenders. So these were major developments, and this was the context within which this discussion about domestic violence fatality review emerged. So I want to start with a basic definition of domestic violence fatality review. And it really talks about identifying and analyzing those deaths that are caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence, broadly defined, in other words. And when we came upon this, or created really this definition back in the mid-90s, the idea was to create a broad conceptual understanding so that in part the states could craft legislation and statute law eventually that would capture these types of cases and ideally create a broad range of analysis to explore just how damaging these kinds of tragedies are. So reviews can be formal, they can be informal. Teams decide how many they do, what depth they dig to in the cases. My personal preference is, an inch wide and a mile deep, as my old friend Matt Dale used to say, but some groups choose to do, a mile wide and an inch deep. And it just depends on what you want to do, what your resources allow you to do. But obviously the idea is to develop preventive interventions. So the first major point that I want to talk about is the philosophy of doing reviews. And this is a radioactive wolf from Chernobyl. And the Chernobyl nuclear explosion in 1986 in what is now the Ukraine decimated the plant, killed a couple of people. Who knows what the long-term health effects were in terms of mortality and morbidity. They were immense in terms of morbidity. But what it created was about 1,000-mile exclusion zone in the now Ukraine, where people couldn't live and couldn't go, and the animals took over. people couldn't live there, the animals moved in. This radioactive wolf is an example of that. And one of the things that we learned, the researchers learned from Chernobyl, was that the Soviets knew about problems in their nuclear industry for probably at least 20 years before Chernobyl happened. But they didn't engage in proper risk assessment. They didn't acknowledge those problems, and they didn't want to address them. And part of the problem was the nature of Soviet society at the time. It was very much a closed society. It was very much contrary to the idea of sort of transparency and openness and discussing problems, major social problems. They had such an emphasis with the nuclear arms race on generating nuclear power that they didn't want to divulge any problems with it. And when you look at this, the accident occurred because of that. And if you look at other accidents from 3 Mile Island in '79, or if you look at the Fukushima disaster, which was mostly about the tsunami, but if you look at the problems, they also failed to do risk assessment around their nuclear plant. So the message here was review and review openly to avoid tragic outcomes. So the nuclear power industry is getting better at that, but in the 80s, it certainly wasn't. And this idea of a culture of safety, of reviewing, of doing it, and bringing people to the table as experts to try to solve these problems was something that was born really out of Chernobyl. That research came out of that. Now we see something similar in the field of medicine. And I can tell you that probably in this country each year, there are at least 250,000 medical error deaths. And this has been documented in the medical literature. So, you know, when you go in for your procedure and they tell you there's a 0.00 whatever it is chance of some accident happening or some problem, and you slowly moving off this mortal coil, you know, what they don't tell you is how many deaths there are a year from medical errors that are preventable. But one of the reasons why there are so many preventable medical errors in medicine is because they don't review thoroughly, B, there are litigation issues and insurance issues that stop that, but C, there is a hierarchy in medicine that does not really permit full discussion of problematic outcomes. So medicine and nuclear power don't do as well as the third sector that I want to look at, which is aviation. And I don't much care to fly myself. I get tired and dried out and bored, but you know, it's much safer than it used to be. Let's have a look. Now, this probably isn't the best example to kick off with, but you know, you'll remember, you've probably seen the Clint Eastwood film Sully, you know, where he takes off out of New York or somewhere and he's flying and, you know, he's going up and they hit a flock of geese about a minute into the flight. And the pilot had, literally, the captain had 60 seconds to make a decision about where to land that plane. Couldn't get to neighboring airports, so he landed it on the Hudson. And he saved all those lives. So here you see those people waiting for their rescue vehicles to arrive. But every life was saved. And when they asked Captain Sullenberger in public presentations, wow, you know, that is amazing heroism, he basically poo-hooed it and said, it wasn't heroism. It was 40 years of great fatality, tragic outcome reviews of crashes. And you have to remember here that it's not like in medicine where, you know, you go in for a colonoscopy and you end up dead, and the person, the gastroenterologist, goes home for a gin in the evening. I mean, the pilot goes down with the plane. So the pilot's got a vested interest in making sure that the plane keeps in the air, right? So that was one thing, but he said, we've got 40 years of reviewing where we brought all kinds of people together in conjunction with the National Transportation Safety Board to make flying safer. He said, in those 60 seconds that we had, I received great feedback from my subordinate, my co-pilot, which 40, 50 years ago, captains didn't necessarily listen to their co-pilots. So, you know, as Sullenberger says here, pilots were autocratic and arrogant. They didn't listen to the first officer. And what Sullenberger says is here, you take a team of experts and they make themselves into an expert team. So what we see in aviation, unlike in medicine, unlike in the nuclear power sector, is tremendous reduction in tragic outcomes. I mean, deaths per passenger mile flown over the last 40 years have diminished greatly. So what the NTSB did, and there's a research literature on this, is that they made a conscious effort to tap the talents of those people who reviewed these tragic outcomes. There was no idea of blame and shame. They didn't want to do that. What they wanted to do was to bring the mechanic together, the person who serves drinks, the person who sells tickets, the person who flies the plane, the captain, and the cockpit crew, all together for discussion purposes when they have outcomes that are negative in aviation. Now, obviously, they can't do that when the plane crashes and everybody dies, but they can still bring these groups of experts together to help work these problems out and to see what could have been done differently. So here's a different way of capturing this. We don't want to blame and shame people. If you point the finger at people, for example, in a domestic violence killing, if you point the finger at the cop at the review table and say, my goodness, you know, if you guys had made an arrest in this case, when you had probable cause to make an arrest rather than use your discretion, this killing wouldn't have happened. Or with a victim advocate, if you'd been sensitive to the trauma of this victim and not done A, B, and C, she wouldn't have died. Now, if you do that, folks are not going to want to come to the table, share information, converse with you, or do anything else. So we don't blame and shame in fatality review. It's not that we don't want to hold people accountable. We demand that. We demand it from agencies, and they usually provide it. If you're there at the table and there are 20 individuals representing 20 different agencies, organizations, and stakeholders, then, you know, those folks call each other on things if they need to, but usually, in my experience of doing reviews, and I've been doing them for 25 years, people are quite open to acknowledging where they could have done a better job. So we have no blame and shame. We want accountability. We learn from other sectors. And that's key with this. The domestic violence sector is just one sector in society that addresses a social problem. So we learn from other sectors that have been there before. And very importantly, we try to create a culture of safety. Now, this isn't some namby-pamby left-wing concept. This is a concept designed to increase information sharing and to tap talent so that people will reveal what they think and know and share their insights. So these philosophical linkages tie in with other organizations. I mean, if you look, for example, at the work of Praxis and the Battered Women's Justice Project, they do community safety assessments. And I remember having this conversation with my old colleague, Ellen Pence, who's long since deceased. And, you know, we were saying there are a lot of similarities between, for example, fatality review and community safety assessments, in that we explore systems. Now, with community safety assessments, we look at the way cases flow through systems in real time. With death reviews, we work back from the death. And in some ways, these ways of doing business, these ways of discovering what happens, work in different directions, but they may very much find similar things. So both strategies use interviews. They use observation. They analyze texts and documents and police reports and protocols and policies. We talk to people. We observe people in the field. So these are the methodologies, if you like. Let's say a few words now about team membership. And this is a painting from Lowry. Lowry was an English painter. He painted scenes from the Industrial Revolution. And I love his work because it's so grim. It's one of the reasons I left England. But you know, the Industrial Revolution in England left these dark satanic mills there, and you had these people that Lowry painted, this motley assortment of individuals. And I sometimes, in my darker moments, I think that fatality review teams reflect this sort of dark assortment of folks who come to the table. Now we can clean it up a little bit and give you this image, which is much more rational, but much less fun. We want a broad membership. We want broad representation because we're going to get a diversity of opinions. And it's in the cracks of the interpretations where the light gets in. It's in the difference in the interpretations that we learn things, the interconnections between these folks. These people are specialists, but they don't always know what other people do. So they learn about the compromises that other professionals face. So this list is not meant to be exhaustive by any means, but what it says is we need a broad range of voices because this is a community problem. It's not just a problem for the police. It's not just a problem for victim advocates or the courts. It's a problem for all of us. So the idea with team membership is to be inclusive and creative. So we want to bring in, however uncomfortable it is for us, we want to bring in family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, people who knew the parties, to ask them questions, because we don't want institutional knowledge alone. We don't want agency and organizational knowledge alone. We want that interface between the community and the state apparatus or official organizations like law enforcement, advocacy, community stakeholders. Again, uncomfortably, we always encourage at NDVFRI teams, if they can, to interview perpetrators. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this today as we talk. But the other thing we encourage a lot of is working with satellite community focus groups and listening groups, perhaps of survivors or others, where we run our recommendations from teams, you know, the preventive interventions that we develop, we run those by community groups of survivors who will give us insights into whether they are worthy, whether they are reasonable, or not, as the case may be. So let's talk now about the scope of cases that we review. And your statutes will differ on this, but the reviewable cases question is really a question of strategy as well, because the idea is to learn things about the operation of systems, about people's lives, about who people are and how they navigate those systems. So the number and the case type, the methods that teams use, there's tremendous variation here. We can't be scientific about this. Most teams cannot review in depth large numbers of cases, so we should forget this idea of creating representative or scientific data. It may be that we could do that nationally after a period of 10 years of gathering common core data, but we're not going to be doing it at the level of the states with the small number of cases they have, particularly given the magnitude of missing data in these cases. So the golden rule here is really to review within your team's own capabilities. What does the team think it can do? What makes it comfortable? What makes it likely that the team will sustain itself rather than taxing itself and really stressing itself? So those are key questions when you're starting. So the first area that I want to focus on is what we call single and multiple homicides. And very crudely, we're looking at about 1,500 intimate partner homicides a year, roughly. It varies, it may go up to 2,000, may go down to 1,500, 1,400 a year, but roughly that's the number of killings a year in this country that we document. About a third of the deaths of women in this country occur in multiple homicides, almost all of them in homicide suicides. In 95% of homicide suicides, the male is the perpetrator. There's a rare number of cases, probably no more than 10 a year, that we might call familicides. These are another forms of multiple homicides. They're extremely rare, and again, they are almost exclusively male perpetrated. So those cases are the bread and butter of fatality review teams. They are the cases that teams take from. And the advantage of reviewing, for example, homicide suicides, is that they are more quickly available. There are usually no pending civil litigation issues in those cases. And of course, both parties are dead, so you don't have to worry about the issue of prosecution and potential appeal. So those cases are eminently takeable, and most teams have reviewed at least some of those. And there's this broad category of cases that we call family killings. And the family killings include parents who kill their children. Now, these are typically reviewed by child death review teams, but we have to remember that about half of child deaths from maltreatment in this country occur against the context of adult domestic violence, typically woman battering. So there is a clear overlap between domestic violence, adult domestic violence, and the abuse and neglect of children. So we usually recommend that teams have representatives from child death review teams on, and vice versa. So family killings, but children also kill their parents from time to time, and some teams have taken to reviewing those cases. Occasionally we have siblings that kill each other, usually brothers killing brothers if we're looking at that phenomenon. Sisters kill sisters less often. Sexual competitor killings. Many statutes allow the review of sexual competitor killings. These often involve men who kill men as they struggle over a woman. Perhaps the previous partner was battering the woman. She moves on to a new partner, and either new partner kills old partner or vice versa. We don't see many women killing women over men, and my colleagues assure me that that's because we men aren't worth it. So let's move on to another area. Suicides. We probably lose more battered women to suicide a year than we lose to homicide. I think that might be an accurate statement. If you look at the number of suicides in the United States, and they're probably up around 60,000 a year, and in fact, with the COVID pandemic, it's probably higher than that. But if you go to the CDC, you'll see this. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it's 50,000, just to keep the numbers simple in my aging head. Let's say that 80% of those involve men, and 20% of those involve women. 20% of 50,000 involve women. That's 10,000 women a year. We reckon anywhere from 5% to as high as 25% of those may involve domestic violence cases where women kill themselves to exit violent or controlling relationships. And this is something that we don't know much about, and that I always recommend that teams review. I'm dealing with a case from the UK at the moment involving a woman who walked out onto a railroad track and killed herself in the face of abusiveness from her elderly partner. So the suicides are eminently takeable. And the idea is that if you mix the case types up that you review, you will learn different things about the way cases flow through systems and the way systems work together. So just a few words now about indirect deaths. These involve drug addiction deaths. We know that battered women medicate their agonies, for example. These involve the deaths of homeless individuals. These involve the deaths of sex workers. Many of those folks have domestic violence in their history. HIV/AIDS deaths. Often, those women who die of HIV/AIDS have histories, biographies of domestic violence in their past. So some teams have taken to reviewing those to show just how damaging this phenomenon is in our communities and how important it is to see domestic violence as a public health issue. There are probably a dozen states, at least, if not more, that now allow the review of near fatalities. And these can be incredibly useful because we have a victim who survives who may well speak with the review team. And the last one of these I did was a few years ago now, but the survivor was able to talk with us about the way she did and didn't navigate systems and what her choices were. She was incredibly articulate woman from the Midwest who spoke a number of different European languages and who really gave us great insights into the case and the systems. Contract killings, we see these, for example, in parts of the Bay Area, where someone will be brought in from overseas to kill usually a younger female family member who is not adhering to social mores or values, and maybe won't, engage in a particular kind of marriage, an arranged marriage, or will engage in behavior that they deem to be shameful for the community and the family and the kinship system. And those contract killings may come from overseas. There may be many perpetrators in those contract killings. And the Asian Pacific Islander Institute have excelled in looking at these deaths. Their publication, Shattered Lives, their analysis of 106 cases involving Asian Pacific Islander people really gets at the microdynamics in some of those cases. They've done great work there. Bystander deaths as well. We see our friends from law enforcement sometimes killed in these disturbing cases. Similarly, our friends in advocacy or just members of the public or people in workplaces. So those are the kinds of case types. Given that we have friends from Mississippi and Arkansas on the line and others, and hopefully folks maybe from Alaska, hopefully folks from Idaho, I want to say a few words about setting up an initiative from the get-go and the kinds of things that we have to think about. Because this really matters if you're beginning these initiatives. So the first thing we really need to know is if I'm dealing with a state, one of the things I want to know is what's the population of the state or the region? I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but it's a big question because, okay, what's the landmass? I want to know if Alaska has 750,000 people, which it roughly does, or Wyoming has, say, 500,000 people. I want to know what that is because I want to know the rate of homicide. The rate of intimate partner homicide in Alaska is the highest in the country at the moment by far. And its suicide rate is also, I think it's the second highest in the country from the CDC data. I want to know what comparable rates are in Wyoming, whose intimate partner homicide rate tends to be lower, significantly lower than that of Alaska, but its suicide rate is way up there. So these are statistics that I want to know. So when teams put stuff together from the get-go, they want to know these bare facts. And good sources of information for these bare facts are organizations like the Violence Policy Center. That keeps numbers on men who kill women, 90% of which are intimate partner homicides or known offender relationships, domestic relationships. So that's a helpful starting point. The National Violent Death Reporting System is another. The Bureau of Justice Statistics is another, potentially. We want to get an aggregate sense, in other words, of domestic violence related deaths. What are the rates? The rates are the things that matter to statisticians. So what's the scope of the initiative going to be? Is it going to be a statewide initiative? For example, in other states, we were talking with our friends in Alaska recently. Our friends in Montana actually have a separate Native peoples, Indigenous peoples review team, which I'm lucky enough to serve on. We've been reviewing cases with the Native American review team in Montana since 2013. So do you want to set up separate review initiatives? Do you want just one initiative statewide? Do you want a county-based initiative? If you have a lot of separate counties, how are you going to do that? Are you going to do that by judicial circuit, by prosecutorial circuit? How are you going to organize that? So in South Carolina, they organized it by prosecutorial circuits and clusters. In other states, they don't have sufficient population. They have one statewide team. So these are important organizational questions. And then you want to think about your review strategy for individual cases. How many cases do you want to review a year in depth? Do you want to review any in depth? Do you want to just do aggregate reviews? How are you going to time that? How are you going to travel? Are you going to go to communities where the death occurred, or are you not? Are you going to do it in one central location, etc.? So when the Massachusetts folks review homicide suicides, they go to the community and they sequester the team for a day to do that. When the Montana team go to review a case, they go for 2 days. They stay in a hotel and they review, and they bring the locals in the second day to help them with their review process. So what are the linkages with other review initiatives? You want bridging links with your suicide initiatives. You want bridging links with your maternal and child death review initiatives, because these things are interconnected. You know, violence traverses the organizational categories that the state produces. This is important to remember. Drug-involved overdose deaths, the opioid death reviews. I mean, Yavapai County in Arizona, under the leadership of the county attorney there and the local authorities, have taken to reviewing opioid deaths using the adult fatality review methodology. And these are promising developments, so that conversation about how we review is important. Now, the phenomenon of intimate partner homicide is profoundly gendered. In other words, it follows patterns related to gender, related to race, class, ethnicity, etc., etc. We know this. About 50% of these homicides have had prior systems contact, but low levels of communication, coordination, and collaboration, we find. About half of the cases, victims appear to die in relative isolation. And this, in fact, this anecdotal observation from the field comports with research data as well into homicides. But the homicides tend to have stylized histories. They have patterns, risk markers. Now, this is the latest chart, which I thank Ray for putting together for me, capturing the rate of females murdered by males over the last 22 years. And this is from the Violence Policy Center, our friends over there. And you can see that there's been a decline. But if we had the data nationally for 2020, we would see an uptick. In Arizona, we've had a doubling of the intimate partner homicides or the domestic violence related killings since the COVID pandemic. So there have been some changes, but we want to note that this curve or graph is not as dramatic as the national decline in the rate of domestic violence itself. If we mapped that from the 1990s, we would see about a 60 to 70% decline from the 1990s to now. The homicide decline is about 30% from the early 1990s. It's not captured in this graph particularly well, but it's a significant decline. The steepest declines that we have are in the African-American community. It could be that medical advances are the reason for this, as well as some of the interventions we've developed. We just don't know. But we can now clot blood better. We can get to scenes faster because we've opened inner city areas up through community policing. And there have been some problems with that. But nevertheless, we've made changes in terms of state infiltration of these communities. So we have research on this that estimates that, and this is just to spell it out, but for emergency medical interventions, the homicide rate in the mid-90s, from the mid to the end of the 90s, which was 15 to 20,000, would have been 45 to 70,000 without the medical advances. So I guess the message here is be careful how we interpret things. We want to know, how do we know what we know? We don't want to be claiming that homicides have gone down because of fatality review activity. We don't know that. We'd like to think that, but we don't know that. So modern medical care in spite of my observations earlier about preventable medical error deaths, has saved a lot of lives. So I just want to put that plug in there for the medical community just to correct things. So how do we organize a fatality review? Let's say a few words. I've got a question in the box and I'm going to answer it right now. Are there funding opportunities through NDVFRI for new teams? If not there specifically, are there other organizations that provide funding specifically? I would suggest, Brandy, that you look at OVW opportunities, Office of Violence Against Women, that you look at OVC. I know some teams have been funded through OVC as well. We do not have direct funding opportunities, but we come to communities, you know, post-pandemic, obviously. We come to communities to train. It doesn't cost you anything. We provide a lot of technical assistance for free, but we can't hire people. That's a state function. We're a federally funded outfit, so we don't provide monies to the states. Okay, so the next, so let me just lay out the 4 or 5 pieces of a fatality review. And this is so simple. I mean, if you join us for a 3-hour session, you'll get your feet wet, but this is a simple process. I mean, we've designed it, not because people are simpletons, but because we've designed it so that it's easy to do. So teams create a timeline, and I'll give you a flavor for that in a moment. They develop a sense of what the red flags or antecedents or risk markers were in cases. We want to know how agencies collaborated, communicated, coordinated their activities. How were services integrated to help victims, indeed to help perpetrators, to prevent death? What are our recommendations as teams? How can we implement those recommendations? We always ask that question. And what outstanding questions do we have? What doesn't the material address for us? What questions remain? So if you're a team that has decided to meet, I don't know, for 3 hours once a month for 6 months to review a case, which the local team, when it was operating, did, you might want to revisit these questions in subsequent meetings. So teams do those 5 things. Here's a typical example, just a portion from a timeline. And again, thanks to Ray for helping me put this slide together. But we look at this and we have a date and a time column on the left-hand column. We have a source column. We want to know where we got our information from, because some of these cases have voluminous information. I mean, I've reviewed cases where we've had 6,000 pages of material. My friend Peter Jaffe up in Canada commonly has 2,000 pages of documentary material to review. The case I reviewed with 6,000 pages, also we did 35 interviews in that case. So there can be a lot of information. So we want to know where we got our information from so we can answer the question, how do we know what we know? So the source column is in the middle, and then the notes column really just basically is a set of notes on what we're referring to, what we're talking about, the significance. The risk questions, and I've just pulled this as one example from our appraise work nationally, but these questions are things that we have in Arizona now that have been recommended by our Supreme Court for use on scene in domestic violence incidents. And police are asking these questions now. As a matter of course, probably half our police agencies now, probably 60 or 70 of them, are asking these questions at scene. And the answers to those questions are being attached to the booking sheet, taken to the jail, and they pass through to the court for the initial appearance of the accused the next day. And the state and defense attorneys get that at the same time. So we have that. So we use this in death reviews. There's a second portion to this. That was the first portion was the mandatory portion that officers have to ask if their police departments have signed up. The second portion is the contextual frame, which is optional, although they usually ask it. So this gives you a sense of the kinds of risk markers that we're looking at. You know this as professionals in the field better than I do. So I don't want to belabor this. Potential documents, again, you would know this as well as we do. But a word of caution, you have to adhere to your statute. You have to know what your statute says and you have to stick to it. So it's going to guide you in terms of what you can legitimately access and what you can't. So that's very important. So I list these things. I'm not going to speak my way through them. I don't have time. But, you know, you've got a sense of the kinds of documents that we're looking at. And NDVFRI is in the process, through our wonderful attorney, Alicia Aiken, of putting together a matrix for the states so that they can see what their statutes enable them to do. And that will be out fairly soon, probably in the next couple of months on our website. Now, I talked earlier about the importance of family, friends. They all know about the lives of survivors, and for that matter, the lives of perpetrators. They are essential to good reviewing. So we want to do collateral interviews. We want to talk with people who knew the parties, victim and perpetrator side. And obviously these reviews have to be conducted in a manner that comports with the rule of law, due process, and your statute and ethical codes. We want to understand the lived experiences of the deceased. We want to see how they navigated systems. Because it's one thing to know what the system purports to do. It's another thing to know how victims see systems and how perpetrators see them and move through them. That's what we want to know. That's what we want to try and put right. So offering a family members a way to participate is also important. So we want to get details above and beyond the document record. So people describe these cases from their own perspective. And it really is like describing an elephant if you can't see. So we appreciate that, we recognize that, and the purpose of fatality review is to get as close as we can to describing the elephant. We want teams to be prepared. It's your responsibility to be well prepared, to know this material. I've been to many reviews where people sit in their hands and they're embarrassed because they haven't read the documents. And I have little sympathy for this, I have to say, but I'm a rather stern British academic. But I have to say that if you're on the team, you need to read the material. This is someone's life that's been lost. So we want reviewers to be well prepared, especially if you're interviewing someone. Knowing the case is really important. Knowing who you want to interview on a team. Our friends in Montana, the review initiative up there, do a great job of developing character lists and having team members go and talk with those folks. Select people who you want to do interviews. Are you going to record? Are you going to take notes? How are you going to do that? If you're there with someone, do you want to take notes? Do you want to record? Does it make them nervous? Do you want to leave afterwards and sit in your car and talk into a tape recorder? How are you going to do that? I'm not recommending any one way. I've used all of those methods, but you need to think about what's going to work for you, and you need to think about it in advance. And you need to go through people who know the family. And you don't need to be afraid of the family either. They'll soon tell you if they don't want to talk. They often do want to talk, and it's cathartic for them. So there are many ways of doing this. Know the case. It will influence the questions that you ask. People are going to assume that you have knowledge of the case. Make sure there are no appellate issues that haven't been resolved. And your statute will guide you on this, but you do need to adhere to that. You need to explain to people you're talking with, especially if it's a perpetrator in prison, that you have no legal influence. So, you know, what you're there to do is not going to influence, for example, any early release. You want to provide a caveat if you're interviewing people about mandatory reporting of things like child abuse if you're a mandated reporter. You need to determine whether there are any civil issues pending, as I said before. So if there's minimal agency contact, these family interviews become much more important still. So we want to know about that. We want to know the family members' perspectives on how agencies worked, how victims and perpetrators saw agencies. Family members asked to be involved, and it was difficult in the early days to navigate their involvement according to the statute. But they report the outcomes of being involved as being generally cathartic. They don't get closure, they've lost their loved one, that's it. but their involvement, their contribution, maybe to helping this not happen again in their community, is something that they find very meaningful. So that includes perpetrators and doing the outreach. So you want to determine the relationship of the family member to the deceased. Was there any victim blaming in this case? Is there any malice regarding the case? Trained, skilled interviewers familiar with fatality review work should interview these family members. We want people with skill and sensitivity, and survivors want to know what the team learned, but they can't always be told what the team learned. There are statutory reasons. Now, the most common question I get asked is, do you have sample letters for outreach? And I do tell people, yeah, if you go to our website, there are some sample letters up there, but let me just cut to the chase here. This is a human interaction. Pick up the phone or write to someone or go through someone you know, but it's a human interaction. So making sort of rote phone calls with letters or sending blind letters may work in some cases, but often people just appreciate a phone call, a conversation, a meeting to talk about those things, a human exchange. Some people are good at it, some people are not so good at it. So friends, neighbors are going to add stuff that we don't know necessarily. One of the cases that we had, I probably shouldn't name the state, involved a woman who'd killed a guy and she cut his throat during a domestic disturbance in the backyard of their house. And when we looked at the police calls to the residents, there had been 12 calls there in the preceding year. And when we looked at the calls, they were all drunk and disorderly calls. They weren't coded as domestics. So it was the neighbors who gave us the information that these were in fact domestic disturbances. And the police would arrive, they would send him off, and he would go sleep it off at a friend's or something, and she would remain at the residence. So, consider contacting neighbors, friends, and others, and do the interviews respectfully. And we all know how to do this. The goal is understanding, not fact-finding, not nitpicking. And I have to say this, the key is you have to be present. And yet, you can't balk at statements that are shocking. I mean, if you're going to cringe when someone reveals something that they've done that is disturbing, don't do these interviews. You need to absorb, be present, build rapport, start off easy, start off slow, and be prepared for potentially a very long interview. Usually, if you're interviewing a perpetrator in prison, you are not going to get the luxury of going there so that you can do like a therapist would in an office, a 50-minute block, then bill the insurance company. What you're going to get is, maybe 6 hours, and you're going to talk to someone. So you've got to be prepared for the long duration and what that means. So this is not sort of controlled emoting. This is something that you have to improvise with. But, you want to reassure folks, you're not there to judge them. You want to express your gratitude for the interview, but you've got to be present. And that's tough. But I tell you, I've seen police detectives do this magnificently. And I've seen victim advocates do this magnificently. Pick your team member to do it. Make sure you make eye contact, be attentive, use empathic listening skills. It's getting inside a story that's not your own. And it's acknowledging loss, even the loss of the perpetrator. And that's tough. So pacing and probing, how do you do this? So you can ask open-ended questions, which are good. You want to know who this person is. And you have to anticipate a non-linear chronology. I mean, if you want to go in there with a set of questions that the team has given you, you can do that. But what I do if and when I do these interviews is I'll go in there with some keywords in my head, or at worst, scripted on a piece of paper on a crib sheet that will be cues to me as I'm prepared to do these conversations. So just think about the dynamics of this. You don't want to break eye contact too much. Attentiveness is key. So you can bring people back. They drift too far away. Encourage elaboration. Encourage them sometimes to be specific. Tell me about that. Could you give me an example? You know, and don't just ignore the fact when people might say, oh, my childhood was great, and you've got someone in here in prison, and you know that 9/10 of folks in there have been physically, emotionally, sexually abused. So don't just let that ride. I mean, find a way to go back. Tell me about that. Let's explore that. We need to recognize too that people are going to recall things in these interviews, whether they be survivors in a near death, whether they be perpetrators, that are going to be painful for them, and we want to be respectful of that. But they've agreed to do the interview. We've maybe gone through their defense attorney if there's one relevant. So we've tried to make provision as best we can, but we want to acknowledge that this can be painful. So the role of trauma, I don't want to spend that much time on. We all know this. I think that folks are poly-victimized. There's a complex role of gender in these cases. If you're interviewing a male versus a female perpetrator, etc., you know, we need to recognize that there are dynamics in these cases that differ. But when I work with male perpetrators who've killed, you know, I often think of James Garbarino's wonderful work. And James, I saw him present some of this work a few years ago, but he says that most male killers are best understood as untreated, traumatized children who inhabit and control the minds, hearts, and bodies of adult men. And this is not to say poor perpetrator, it's to recognize the characteristics in most of these cases. So working from that basis is really important. And appreciating, you know, the plight of folks is important. So we might want to think a little bit about whether we just want to come from this perspective that these men are all powerful and domineering and controlling, which they may have been perceived that way in the relationship, but there's a little bit more to it than that. There may not necessarily have been a conscious plot to do certain things. We want to recognize the role of race and culture, maybe even sexual orientation in some cases. We want to recognize that these men often were simultaneously powerful and powerless. This is the great paradox of the work that we do. And we want to recognize that there are controls in these cases, and they may have exerted some, they may have attempted to control people, but they may not have been operating at the level of active strategizing. So we want to recognize too that power and control flow, and they're bidirectional in some relationships. So these questions about intent, we want to be careful about what we might presume that we bring in as baggage from our work in the field with people. So in the field, we see a more complex mix, for example, of batterer behavior. There's sometimes clear calculation and manipulation, but sometimes these men who kill have feelings that are really undeveloped. They don't know what they're doing necessarily. We may be dealing with unconscious drives, or even biological forces or genetic forces sometimes, or psychopathy, or sometimes things we just can't explain. So bearing in mind all these things really matters and really provides us with a sort of a skeptical philosophy as we go in. We're not there to retry the case. We're not there to establish guilt or innocence. We're there to try to understand. So it's a different motif than, say, a trial. Now, the majority of women intimate partner offenders, intimate partner homicide offenders, tend to have experienced prior abuse. And Getting's work in 1985 pitched that at 71%. My own study in Florida pitched that at 83%. I analyzed the life histories, the relationship histories of 67 men who killed. I analyzed women who killed. I think it was a much smaller number than that, but nevertheless, I think it was 24 women who killed. But anyway, 83% of them had experienced prior abuse. So it's a significant issue in these cases. But not all female perpetrators act in self-defense. It's important to remember that. There can be bidirectional violence, financial problems, greed, avarice in relationships, fraud, revenge, a new partner involved. There can be mental illness. These are all issues that we need to think about. We also need to think about memory impairment if we're interviewing perpetrators, female or male. About 25 to 40% of them claim amnesia. And it's, you know, another one of my heroes in this field is James Gilligan's work. He's done some fabulous work. He wrote a great book on violence. One can never know for certain what's going on or has gone on in another person's mind. Or as Agatha Christie, I think, once put it, few of us are what we seem to be. These are important observations. So, you know, we have to be alive to the possibility that people are faking. In other words, they're pretending not to remember, to reduce their responsibility or to reduce their guilt. Maybe provides an excuse for them not to discuss their criminality. This tends to be more common in violent offenses and sexual crimes. That faking is often associated with low IQs and personality disorders and poor executive functioning, maybe head injured people, brain damaged people. So we can test for this if we want to. I'm not suggesting that teams do that, but we can. Malingering and faking is also associated with recidivism. So these debates are important. There's an ongoing debate about amnesia. How relevant is it? Do people blank out? Do people really dissociate? What does that look like? So I recommend teams, or at least one team member, consider looking at James Garbarino's book, Listening to Killers, or James Gilligan's book, Violence, or ideally both of them. And this is going to sound bizarre, but the act of killing itself, the act of killing a family member, is in and of itself traumatizing. So we're very rightly focused on the trauma of victims, and so we should. But killers themselves, when they kill, are traumatized, and there is a literature on this too. So remembering that is important for the respectful, ethical interview. So interviews themselves may re-traumatize. So thinking about that is important. You need to interview slowly, be prepared for the time. Don't be visibly perturbed by, for example, dissociative behavior. If someone is dissociating in front of you, the last thing you want to do is to show shock or horror. So you have to be there in the moment and observe whatever it is you're observing. A change in facial expression, even a change in the hair, a change in perspiration, a change in speech pattern. To be present during those things is important, and to be attentive is important, however disturbing that may be. People have secret lives and secret thoughts. We all do. So we want to know people's perceptions of systems, how they thought about systems. Okay, cognizant of my time, I'm going to move on now and say a few words, because I'm always delayed and always late, never get through what I get through. And Ray smiles at me wisely, but I do my best. Let's say a few words now about doing virtual reviews, because we've been training on these, doing these, and we welcome you if you want to sample some of our mock reviews, getting your feet wet, doing this virtually. A lot of teams now are doing this, but there are some key issues that I just want to focus in on. And I want to talk a little bit about timing, the organization of information, how we stimulate discussion, how we tap talent, how we create feedback loops within the process when we do our mock reviews, and how we incorporate collateral interviews and with key informants. So say a few words about each. There's an onus, an emphasis really with mock reviews, and certainly our mock reviews, there's an emphasis on precision timing. And this may sound anal and uptight, but if you've got 20 busy people, as indeed I think we have tomorrow, we're doing a training with the Oklahoma Fatality Review Board tomorrow. So let's say for argument's sake, we have 20 people there. We've got a block of time of 4 hours, and they want an hour at the end for discussion, but we will have 3 hours of mock review activity. The timing is precise. We'll spend 20 minutes explaining the process of doing the fatality review. I'll take 15, Ray takes 5 to lay out all the technological aspects of the case. Then the team has 2 hours to review the case, and we'll take those 20 people and we'll break them into 2 groups of 10. And they'll be separate teams. They'll review the same case, they'll build their timeline, they'll build their red flag analysis, they'll build their agency and community organization involvement piece, and then they'll make their own recommendations. And then in the last 40 minutes, they will get 5 minutes each to present different elements, amongst those 4 elements of the case. And then they will critique each other constructively. So that's how we do it. That's how we build the feedback loop, but it's dependent upon time. And these are COVID times, so we have to be respectful of folks' time. So the precision timing is important. The organization of information is also very important. If you do a mock review with us, we will give you the case. We will give you a distilled version of the case, which is roughly 8 to 10 pages long. You will get it a week before, and you'll come equipped for that review, and we'll break you into groups. But this is true for reviews in general. You need to be organized with the data, the information. How do we stimulate discussion? That's an art. We need someone to facilitate in those groups, as well as we need someone to record the information. And we need someone to facilitate who can ask probative questions, who understands the complex dynamics of intimate partner violence cases, who understands the seemingly counterintuitive behavior of victims. So we need those things to keep the ball rolling and to probe and to ask questions and to make sure that we get involvement from everyone. And that recorder needs to make sure that that stimulating discussion is captured and written down in, for example, the timeline and into those other sections of the review. This is the most important slide in a way. This is how, I want you to think about this. These tap dancing shoes, I know it's corny, but just think about it and relate this to that plane floating on the Hudson. They floated that plane on the Hudson after the engine was wiped out with those geese by tapping the talent of all those people who contribute to aircraft crash reconstructions. And they did it, and they've saved lives from doing it. We want to do that. The expertise at the fatality review table is remarkable. I never cease to be amazed at my ignorance when I hear people wax lyrical about what they know about these cases. It's remarkable. We want to tap it. So we want people to talk. We want the feedback loops. And as I said, we play teams off against each other in order to stimulate that discussion, but we want that built in. So I mentioned community feedback loops earlier, but when we do virtual reviews, we want to build that discussion in. We're still doing collateral interviews. I did an interview a while ago with some family members in the UK regarding a case that I was working on. And I was able to do collateral interviews using Zoom. And I have to say that that has its own implications. It has its own dynamics. You have a proximity to people that you don't have when you're in the same physical space as them. You can or you may not want to record the interview, but you can, I mean, for example, I'm horrified. I have many lines in my face, but they can see the lines in my face up close, and vice versa. You can see emotion, you can read emotion, even although you're not viscerally in their presence. So these exchanges raise different questions that we really have to think about. So I encourage you to think about that in advance. Don't leave it until you actually get on the screen and you've got a couple of grieving neighbors who lost their loved ones. You want to think about, you know, maybe their neighbors who they were very close to or whatever. So, you know, think these things through. So the whole process of doing virtual review, and this is really a mirror of doing fatality reviews in general, but the whole process of doing it virtually is careful preparation and people being responsible and organized, bringing information to the table. But we have seen this done now, and teams are reviewing virtually across the country. They are sharing information, and we have a webinar up online that Ray may kindly be able to reference. But under NDVFRI and resources, if you go to that tab under videos, I think it's under videos, you will see the webinar that we did on virtual reviews. And that is myself jabbering on, but it's Ray making a very useful contribution on the technology piece. And then it's also our confidentiality attorney, Alicia Aking, talking about confidentiality issues in doing virtual reviews. So those are some of the things that we've got available, and I'm now going to move on a little bit and talk about some of the implications of doing virtual reviews. They're obviously an adaptation to COVID. We didn't do them before, and this was something as an initiative we set up and moved on fairly quickly. But there are different opportunities for networking here. You know, it's different from the way the team works. So the team will drag its feet sometimes to get there. But I have to tell you, the teams that have done this liked it. And the teams that have done this are going to keep this because it's cheaper, it's quicker, and you can still do really good detailed reviews. It may be more directed, it may be more deliberate, the work may be more succinct, but it's still beneficial, but it's different. So this is really worth considering. Now, if you spend $10,000 a year, for example, on your review team, traveling to a community to stay overnight, 2 nights, and then you travel back and you pay per diem mileage and hotel expenses. And as a grant administrator, I know these details well. It's a lot of money. If you can do one of those 2 reviews that you do a year virtually, you save half that pot of money. So teams, and I know people at OVW are also thinking about these issues. It also overcomes some of the weather problems. If you're in states like Montana or Alaska, you know, you're gonna be limited anyway in terms of how you travel to communities when you do that. So again, it doesn't just save time and money, it's a different spatial arrangement. Now, there are advantages to being somewhere, and I look forward to going to the Montana Indian Country Review Team meetings once every 6 months because we hang out together. We go for dinner together, we eat together, we play together, it's fun. So there's that element that is missing. So some folks, some teams have taken to having happy hour on a Zoom call. So I'm just letting you know that there are still ways to overcome some of those things as well, but nevertheless, it's different. So let's move on and say a few words about why should we do fatality review in general? I mean, why on earth would we bother to do this? So we have to be candid about this. We don't know the outcomes of doing fatality review work. We might be able to say in a big picture way that since the passage of VAWA in 1994, there has been probably a 70% decrease in domestic violence in general. I think that's probably a fair-ish statement. Maybe it's 65%, maybe it's 75%, but it's of a significant order of magnitude. We can also say that the homicides have gone down significantly, maybe 30%, but as I said earlier, we don't necessarily know why. But we can also note that with the passage of VAWA, of which fatality review was one outcome of that, we have seen a change in public attitudes towards family violence in general and an acknowledgement of the traumatizing effects of this behavior. And there's probably been a change of about 30 or 40 percentage points in that, in the general population, which in the space of a generation is a massive demographic change. So that stuff is significant. So the spread of fatality review implies it's useful. But we don't want to go pretending that we can argue from the recommendations that get implemented that we've saved lives. We can't prove a negative. So there's no quasi-experimental design here where we track states that developed fatality review and compare them with a matched sample of states that didn't develop it. And then we compared them over time and we thought, oh, lo and behold, the homicide rate over here went down much more than it did over here. We don't have those comparisons because pretty much all the states, 46 states, moved to do fatality review within the time span of 20 years. So you think about this as a researcher or a statistician, you're going to need 15, 20 years to look at the changes in the numbers of deaths. and the death rates. So it's just unwieldy to even suggest that we could do a controlled experiment. And certainly you can't do a random control trial on this in the way that the epidemiologists might like to do. So what we say is anecdotal, and I always tell teams, don't suggest that what you've done lowers death because you can't prove it, but you can point to specific things that you've done that common sense tells you end up benefiting victims. And you can talk about those in a testimonial way, and I think that's very positive. So what do we want to look for as teams? What do we want to track with teams in terms of outcomes? We want to track changes in laws. And I'm going to give you one example from the state of Montana where there have been some changes in law, but we want to track changes in law and law-like systems. We want to track the expansion of teams. So for example, when I first went to Montana in, I think it was 2001 or 2002, there were a group of 7 people that formed the nucleus or core of what would become one of the largest and most significant death review initiatives in the country, or anywhere for that matter. They had 7 people, but they had the support of then Attorney General Mike McGrath, who's now Chief Justice of their Supreme Court, and they moved that forward. And that team now, sometimes when we go to review, they will have 40 people in the room contributing to the review of a case. They have 18 core members and a number of ex officio members, and they've expanded the team out into different systems and out into communities. And in addition to that, they involve the local community as well. So team expansion, we want to track. Team connectivity and networking, we want to be available. We want to be aware of. We want to see how that connectivity, how that social networking changes and expands. We want to track public education and awareness campaigns concerning domestic violence. Very importantly, this 4th bullet, we need to know about shifts in collaboration, communication, coordination, cooperation, integration of services, because that is where we think we'll get the most traction in terms of prevention. Again, it's hard to prove. And again, we don't want to be naive here. We know that there are systems problems, but we think that this is one way that we may make a difference. We want to look at the implementation of team recommendations. We obviously want to track these rates of violence, homicide, and DV in general. We want to track shifts in resources, resource allocation and funding. These are big issues. And one of the biggest developments in fatality review over the years has been acknowledging just how pervasive the problem is and just how many different case types it affects, as I laid out a little bit earlier. Tracking attitudinal shifts is harder, especially at the level of state and in local communities. But certainly the national and international surveys we have show that there have been quite remarkable changes, as I mentioned. We want to track the access of teams to state and local government. And those teams aren't there to lobby, but those teams are there to present information. And then we want to track longer term changes and improvements in communication. And one of the specific outcomes that is linked to fatality review development is the refinement and introduction, perhaps, or refinement of risk assessment interventions. And again, we can't predict homicides. We're not saying that. What we're doing here is we're using risk assessment tools like we do in Arizona, really as reconnaissance and educational tools in cases to connect victims with services, to present greater information to the court, and to make sure that we have greater intelligence and greater sensitivity to victims at scenes from patrol officers. So it's a whole philosophy. It's not just a form. And we have separate webinars coming up on that. And I know that 2 of our senior police officers will be presenting in a webinar fairly soon. I believe that Ray will probably put up in the chat box so that you're aware of that. Those guys are amazing. So these risk assessments are linked to what we learn from fatality review. So we always say to folks, you know, look at your risk assessment outcomes. the case minutiae that you identify as risk markers, and see, are we tracking these things in our risk assessment tools in our communities? So What were some of the changes in a state like Montana? This is just one example that I'm focusing on. And I have to say that because I serve on a team in Montana, this is one of the reasons I mention this. But if you go to our website and you look at our film on the Montana State Commission, again, it's on our homepage. It's a 20-minute film. It's a great film. It will talk about many of these things that I'm about to talk about now. And then there's a parallel film that's about 30 minutes long called Saving the Next Generation. And that's about the review team in Indian country. And it talks about reviews in each setting with each review team. But the Montana folks produced their Hope Card, which was basically a credit card size, copy of an order of protection with the picture of the offender on it, the terms of the order. It's indestructible, and it doesn't take the place of an order, but it mirrors the order. And rather than relying on a piece of moth-eaten paper at a crime scene that the police officer can't recognize at 2 in the morning, that's valid on its face, you produce the card, it has a hologram on it, and it's verifiable within the system. Montana's strangulation laws. There have been hundreds of new charges resulting from the new strangulation laws, which came out of fatality review presentations to the legislature. The director of the team presents directly to the legislature in Montana. So this is very powerful stuff. The use of risk assessments in Montana stemmed from the fatality review work. They're using our Arizona risk assessment instrument, the Appraise tool, in Billings, the biggest city in Montana, in eastern Montana. And they're also using a high-risk model in the capital, Helena. Better screening by mental health professionals for DV and by victim advocates looking for suicidality, which is one of the latest risk markers to emerge out of the research in England on what's dangerous and what isn't. So powerful stuff. Dissemination of model forms for victim notification of inmate release. Statutory changes in the automatic issuance through a magistrate of a no contact order at the time of the arrest of the accused for DV. Expansion of the crime victim compensation to include counseling. Increased knowledge and resources for victims with limited English proficiency. Electronic version of the Montana Law Enforcement Academy's DV Field Guide. Increased penalties for stalking and cyber stalking. Combating the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is a huge issue across North America. But again, this came out of their fatality review work, and that Indian country review team splintered off of in relation to the state team in 2013, I think. So, centralizing that missing persons database, full-time Department of Justice employee dedicated to that. Again, these are important issues for our friends in Indigenous communities. So I think, and again, I'm getting the look from Ray, so I'm going to try to wind this down here, but I think fatality review poses different questions for folks and raises new issues. We often ask the question, or some people ask the question, why doesn't she leave? In fact, a journalist asked me that yesterday in an interview, an English journalist. And I always say, well, why doesn't he leave? Why does he cling and pine for her often? The fatality review, if you do interviews with perpetrators, they may or may not go to those places where they'll talk about these things. But the clinginess, the dependency, the vulnerability of the batterer is an important element in many of these cases, especially when we're dealing with a non-psychopathic batterer. The emotional isolation of perpetrators. The problematic notion of control. We see these men killing when control is ebbing, not when they've got it. The issue of humiliated fury, the relationship between shame and violence. Again, if we do our nuanced interviewing and we piece these things together with multiple interviewees, we get a greater sense of what's going on. And what we find in these killings is the centrality of anger. And this is a really important point because the movement likes to play down the role of anger. And anger management is not the solution to these questions, but anger is central to these killings and these extreme cases. And the failure to regulate anger is a key issue. So failing to recognize that is important. It problematizes, fatality review problematizes the notion of intent. It really makes us aware of the fact that some of these feelings that men have when they kill, and some women too, are undeveloped, aren't clear. It challenges the notion of things like battered woman syndrome, cycles of violence, learned helplessness, and these stock scripts that we have of this virtuous victim and this one-dimensional male villain. I mean, these are naive ways of seeing these cases, and the case reviews, if they dig deeply, problematize these stereotypes that we have. And they require us to ask questions. How do we really know what we know? In other words, battered women who end up being killed eventually, when we look at what they're doing before their demise, we see what I refer to as resistive maneuverability. They have much more agency than sometimes we give them credit for. And case reviews create a strong sense of this complexity that traditional advocacy approaches, especially with younger advocates, may not get at, may not appreciate in the way that is perhaps as authentic or as perhaps as accurate as it could be. And then in terms of safety planning, we get a whole array of questions. But one thing I think we must learn is that, and this is a chilling takeaway, but I think it's accurate, is that safety planning with victims of violence always take into account the fact that victims can never really know what perpetrators are capable of. And that's a chilling message, because I've heard so many times, he wouldn't do this, he wouldn't do that, he wouldn't kill the children, and then he does. And it's not to blame victims, but it's to acknowledge the empirical reality of fatality review, that we in fact can inform folks about these things. So I'm gonna close there. That should be Family Violence Center, not Family Violence Institute. That's my phone number if you want to talk. I love chatting with folks in the field.